Welcome to Origins, the podcast that dives deep into the business of venture capital, where we learn how the people behind the capital, both GPs and LPs, make decisions. I am Beezer Clarkson, your LP co-host from Sapphire Partners, where we aim to invest in exceptional early-stage venture capital managers ranging from emerging to established franchise VCs. And once again, as Nick is on family leave, I'm joined by one of my absolute favorite people, my colleague and partner at Sapphire Partners and co-founder of OpenLP, Laura Thompson. Laura, thanks so much for coming back on.
It's great to be back. Thank you so much for continuing to have me on this very fun mini-series that we're building.
And yes, as you mentioned, we are hot off another episode in our mini-series on what it takes to be a franchise fund. In our last episode, we talked to Jessica Archibald, who is a fellow LP over at Top Tier Capital. And I'm super excited to unpack this conversation with you because, don't know if you noticed it, but her and Stephen not always on the same page in really interesting ways.
You know what? I had the same thought. And it was so interesting because last time we were debriefing with Stephen, who is, of course, an LP at Adams Street and formerly of the Packard Foundation. And he really focused on the importance of having that one lights out fund and being on the best cap tables of the best founders when it comes to building a franchise. And Jessica, I think, took it in a very different direction and was just much more focused on what that means from an LP perspective. And I think it's really neat is you could take two wonderful, highly esteemed LPs who have a very different take and both have some very good thoughts around it.
Yes, you make a great point. I had the same thought. And I don't know, maybe that's where the contextual background of an LP's experience comes into play, right? Jessica has had 20 plus years at Top Tier. And before that, she was at where Top Tier spun out of Paul Capital. And I knew this, but kind of forgot. So I was glad she reminded me. She was a math engineering person, so is very analytical and breaks things down in a logical way. And Stephen, of course, has his direct experience background and came from the GP to the LP side. So brought a lot of that to his thinking. And I don't know, it was very cool. And there's definitely a lot for the two of us to unpack. Should we dive in?
Let's do it. So Beezer, last time we started with my big key takeaway. So let's start with you. What stuck out with you the most?
It really stuck out to me that Jessica's started off the bat with the LP experience of a franchise fund, whereas Stephen first led with the sort of the insides of the franchise fund, right? Not just the return they had to hit, but what it meant to sort of extend and bring people in and be able to replicate the doing of it. Whereas Jessica just dove right in and said franchise funds don't have challenges fundraising, which I experienced as an LP perspective. Did you experience it that way?
I did too. And I think it was just so great to have those two angles because you kind of need both, right? You need LPs do need to fund GPs, but then, what kind of goes into the very easy fundraising processes probably is being on the best cap tables over time and generating those returns. So I thought it was very interesting to have the two pieces of kind of the puzzle put together.
Yes. And she really honed in on the LP experience also with the how you communicate, what you do. Let me ask you if you experienced this too, which was without LPs funding the fund, you can't have a franchise fund. It's chicken and egg, obviously, but the LPs have to put money in for there to be a fund. And it just sounded to me like there was a lot of that from her thinking.
That resonated with me too. And then also when she was talking about kind of the durability of funds over time and succession and being able to communicate with LPs and go through major changes in a fund, that also, I think, really hit home because over time, all these funds are going to have major changes, especially with departures and transitions. And I think a key is communicating with your LP base so there aren't surprises and so people know there's a plan.
I'd be curious to get your view, Laura. I get asked this by GPs. I'm sure you do too. What is the guidance you give folks on how early do you tell people about changes? Because there's a bit of that balance of, well, when and how do you communicate? The good news, I'm assuming, is always great. But when and how do you communicate some of the tougher news?
Yeah, I love that. So I think, first of all, way in advance of that, I feel like GPs need to decide whether they want to build a franchise and you need to have some kind of policies in place from the beginning. Are you going to try and add people? Are you creating a culture that you're going to add people? Are you creating a performance culture? Those types of things. And then I think to your specific question, you can never tell LPs, I think, before you tell the person, right? The person needs to know, they need to be comfortable. It needs to be handled professionally. And we're talking about the bad news situations because as you said, good news is good news, yay, for everyone. You have to tell someone in advance. And then I do think that LPs want to know fairly real time, especially if it's a senior member of the team, because as you know, LPs are giving kind of blind pools of capital and they want to know who's deploying this. And so I think LPs want to know more real time than I think some people realize. And I think, LPs don't want to hear in TechCrunch, right? And, it's just not, it doesn't feel like a partnership when that happens. And I think, I don't know if you have some best practices, but I think often, GPs will call members of the LPAC and then figure out how to communicate more broadly. But it's it's usually pretty timely when it happens.
Yes. And I think part of what Jessica was talking about too is not maybe performance-related departures or also just retirement, right? There's only way to do succession presumably means someone senior person has decided to leave because their work there is done. And you bring somebody else up. You mentioned the whole thing about, which I thought was amazing, and my brain's still thinking about it, which is you go into being a franchise fund thinking about succession and legacy, and you build differently. Are there things that you think about in performance cultures that are more helpful? Because incentives are very powerful and difficult sometimes, right? Because it's a dollar-driven performance metric. And what do you want to drive? Dollars out the door, dollars back in the door, TVPI, DPI?
What really resonated to me when you and Jessica were chatting was your point about economics, because what you just said about incentives, like at the end of the day, people recognize their worth based on, kind of these financial incentives and also their importance and ownership of the firm. And I think we've seen some really thoughtful firms that have known they want to be enduring franchises decide to do equal partnerships or have pathways where folks know they can grow into those positions. And I think you have to be really deliberate and transparent about that. And it's also hard. That means someone who's built the firm or started the firm and did all the initial work has to cut down their economics. And that can be really difficult. I'm curious if you have other kind of best practices or things you've seen that lead people to be more successful.
If I had to boil it down to a simple statement, I would say the intentionality. I think what I'm hearing from you when I think through the managers that we've seen kind of make the jump to franchise, and certainly ones that we're not part of, but you can see that have gone on to do it. My assumption is even if they didn't start out that way, at some point they decided they had to be very intentional, because you will lose people if they don't have a sense of agency. And maybe that doesn't mean they're in the management company day one, but what is the path? And then do people step back and make room? And then how do you, and this is building a bit on what Stephen was saying, how do you templatize but not make rigid your culture and way of doing things? As one of our managers said to me, who I think is a franchise, we want to bring on new people and they need to fit our culture, but also expand it. And that was really powerful, but there was intentionality in that. I don't know if you can oops your way into this.
And this is making me think about two things. So one is, what do you do in the culture of the past couple years where people who are not proven, and we can debate what proven is, are all getting a partner title or all having titles? Like how do you decide when, I think it's probably too long to wait for DPI to promote someone. But what do you do in those situations? Because the other thing I was thinking about is people have options and we see it. So if people don't see a pathway and don't feel like they're kind of being appropriately recognized, there's other options out there. Maybe fewer options than in 2021, but still options.
I'm wondering if there is a one-size-fits-all answer. When I think quickly through the top funds, it feels a bit specific to each firm's culture. And that part of what keeps the culture strong is the reward system works within it. And so maybe it's cutting people into past carry. So they get, to your point, waiting for DPI takes forever. So there's an acknowledgement that way, or maybe there's an acknowledgement in certain kind of ownership rights in the firm. I think it really varies depending on how the firm itself is run. But there is something about that which sort of translates into if you're going to be a partner here, what is your agency and what's your engagement? Or if it's a culture which is sheerly about put up points on the board, then it's points on the board. However that's defined, right? Because we can debate TVPI versus DPI another time, but sometimes people get measured on TVPI or IRR, including LPs. And so those are the points that people need to put on the board.
I love that.
There's something that Jessica talked about on this, which is stuck in my head. I thought it was fascinating, and maybe I'm the only one, that they look at the performance basis as not they obviously care about the overall performance of the fund, but looking at how long to 1x DPI and that they were shooting for a bogey of 9 years and faster than that was sort of overperformance and longer than that was a problem. Did that resonate with you the same way?
This is actually funny. This was the next point I was going to bring up. I don't think she's clearly a math mind because I was looking at the Cambridge numbers and I think a 10-year fund upper quartile is something like 1.9x. If you look at 2014, 2015 is over 1x and 2016, I think is 0.8x. So like clearly, the upper funds have reached kind of those milestones. But then we have a fund focused on early stage investing at seed and Series A. So if people really want if they want those types of DPI in year 9, are we idiots? Like, are we in the wrong part of the ecosystem? Because that almost makes me feel like you should have like a buyout growth portfolio, right? Because if you're doing it's tricky. And I was curious what your reaction was.
I did have a moment of pause and I thought, well, is this the role of crypto? Or maybe buyouts? I think Jessica was really looking at venture though.
I think so too. But venture, clearly there's a difference probably between growth stage and investing at pre-seed. I
agree. I'm triangulating because there are other statements around also looking at funds that were no bigger than $750 million for performance. My experience of her answer was probably more early stage than growth, but maybe it's a mix. She was very clear that if something's longer than 15 years, given that's when they cut their fund of funds off, that they have to start selling the goods. Open question in this environment. The only other thing I think historical to the last 4 years of drought, maybe those numbers weren't as hard. But it does go to I think this is why her number foots to the Cambridge numbers, which is, it's not an easy thing to do. It does mean you have to have a big company that does something, a big returning company, right?
What I heard is you should have a fund returner because it's very hard to then cobble together those types of returns using kind of smaller outcomes. But then on the flip side, to your point about fund size, it's really hard to underwrite something to be 10 or 20 billion. There's just not that, like every fund, most funds look very good with those types of outcomes. There's just very few. So what is kind of the sweet spot for being able to get a fund returner? And I think that's when she was really looking at kind of ownership and what each company could contribute to a fund. But I did, your point resonated with me too, which is if you're a small fund, how do you ever get 10% post all the dilution? It's very tricky.
It also made me think of her next comment, maybe not next in the podcast, but when we're talking about how do you get liquidity, was the role of secondaries in the current today's market to manufacture liquidity. And if you're a smaller fund, you could potentially, and it sounds like they have folks in their portfolio who have 1x their fund doing a thoughtful secondary. I don't know if you could, I guess if you were a titchy fund, you could 5x your fund on a secondary. But it reminded me, and we're not seeing it right now because the exit market is a bit slower and you don't have, maybe in the AI companies, you have these extraordinary valuations. But we have managers, and there's lots of managers in the past who have 1x their fund selling into a round. And maybe the secondary market now is the analogous to that behavior.
I love that point because as I was listening to your discussion, I was like, well, our industry's broken because the fund lives are shorter than when you exit some companies. But then as I was processing, I was like, well, maybe the industry needs to evolve and maybe it is kind of the secondary market, which I think works for some managers better than other managers. And then I don't know kind of your thoughts on this, but it feels like it's a very nuanced when it works for the manager, when it works for the company. It's not a blind rule because, I was trying to think about the role of an LPAC and it's to support managers, but you also have to respect how they operate and really think about each situation. But I was curious how you think about the LPAC and advising on secondaries.
Oh, I love that. Yes, I think if you have a well-constructed LPAC with LPs, to your point, that have your best interest in heart and can bring their experience to bear to help you answer the question of what are the things to think through, that's very useful to GPs. You and I know the same GPs that collect a lot of viewpoints and make their own decisions, which feels right? They know the business, and I don't know about, at least there hasn't been an LPAC that I've been on where I've been able to talk to the CEO and ask them what they think. But the GPs are in conversation, and there's obviously also employees and other people to keep in mind. And I know GPs get pressure from different LPs at different times for liquidity, and that can be a hard balance.
I don't know what you think, but I would be sad if someone did a lot of secondaries and ended up with a 2X fund when they could have ended up with a 4X fund for holding a little bit longer. And she made this great point about what happens to companies in those later years. Are they really growing, or is there a lot of risk to companies in those stages, which I don't know, maybe where the GP kind of analysis comes in, the relationship with founders, because I don't know if you formulaically want to sell things at a certain year. I think maybe it is kind of situation dependent.
I think so, because when I think of the rule of thumbs that GPs and LPs were discussing back in the heyday, remember when there were exits and everyone was very excited?
Can you make those come back next year?
A rumor has it they're totally coming back. All the 2025 predictions say it's going to be great. Just wait. But I remember there was a conversation where it basically said, if you can sell between 15 and 25%, it sort of sound like different people had different numbers, and half to 1x your fund, those were pretty good guardrails because you still had enough, 75 to 85% of your holdings were still there if the company's still going to run. And people use those to sort of assess taking money off the table.
One interesting thing is I loved when you guys were talking about performance and what that means. And would love to just spend another minute digging into, kind of Stephen's one outlier fund, which I think there's more than just that, but like one lights out fund versus Jessica saying, kind of 3X is the new, I think it was 2X over time. And, clearly it depends on a vintage year, but I was curious, like, we get this question all the time, like, look at my track record, what needs to be true to like really be a standout kind of firm? And just curious, like, how you would answer that today.
Well, in the market of no exits, it is definitely difficult. So you do end up in the, how are the health of the companies, what's going on? But I felt that her answer to your point was, and I think Stephen was similar, you can have one ginormously awesome fund, but if there isn't any consistency of that performance, that does not a franchise make. That might make you wealthy, that might make your LPs happy, but it's not going to make you a franchise. And to be a franchise, you have to be able to do this. And not every fund's going to have the same performance. We know this. It can vary a bit, but you have to have some consistency. And I can't remember if I mentioned this on the podcast before, but I remember we were diligencing a fund a while ago, and they were pretty much a solid 2.5 net DPI fund time over time. And I asked one of the LPs, and I said, does this really count as extraordinary performance? And they felt the consistency of that was phenomenal because it wasn't spiky. You didn't have a 5X and then like a 1.2. And they basically said over time, you're going to average kind of there anyway if you take all the dollars. And this way they knew it. This was not a growth fund. They just were people that knew what they were doing. They stayed in their lane. They kept the fund size pretty much similar. And I also think from an LP perspective, and I think Jessica kind of started with this, was there just weren't any surprises. And the LPs valued that, even if that sounds boring. It was I go to sleep at night and I do not worry about you. And there is obviously some LP value in that.
I do think, and we use the phrase boring is beautiful often because you don't want major surprises in your LP base. And I think that's true. And, it's funny, I was just about to ask you to play a numbers game, but I realized there's not that many scenarios. I was going to say, like, is 2X over time, but is that franchise? Because that feels low to me. That feels like you should be in buyout or something else. But what about 2.5? What about 3? What about 2.5 and then 1 spikes to 4? Like what feels like that kind of top tier return profile?
I think you can count on very few hands and feet how many funds do a routine 3X net in a row. So I do think it probably averages over time, which is a dirty secret of venture, but you get those. If you can get a couple of those lights out funds and then consistency, that probably adds up over time to more dollars back for your LPs. And that's what they want.
I totally agree. I was like, if someone can get 3X and then a spike or 1 or 2, because I do think, like to Stephen's point, those funds that are 4, 5, 6, up to 10X, they get a lot of brand, there's a lot of recognition, I think, within the industry and in the LP industry ecosystem. And then you get, oh my gosh, this fund. And then if you can repeatedly put up even 2.5, but 2.5, 3 over time, it's really hard to do. Venture is just hard and hard to do over time.
Mm-hmm. Because you need exits and fund size math and inflation and interest rates and
some of those really, really big winners that there are some, but not a gazillion.
Correct. I saw something on Twitter, I should have grabbed it, which had charts of the major exits. The kind of math that we typically actually do for the enterprise and consumer reports that we've done. And it was somewhat sad how many north of $5 billion exits have there really been, given the number of funds that have fundraised predicated on having that size funds exits or plus. And the two are just do not line up. I want to bring up one last point because I just thought it was so endearing that they did this, that they give letter grades to different I guess we've obviously have the same metrics. Like you go through performance, you go through team, you go through these different considerations, but they actually give people grades. Did you respond the same way I did?
I loved it. And it also didn't surprise, given our discussions on kind of metrics and analytics, and they do such wonderful work, in those categories. It didn't completely surprise me that there was, but I did love it. And, all A's or A minuses is a pretty high bar, but I think it's true. Like you have to be good on, a lot of those or all of those categories, because you might have excellent performance, but if you're not handling team well at all, what happens to that performance over time? So I did love that they give letter grades. I was wondering, I don't know, maybe we should, take a page from their book.
Oh, I thought about that. And then I thought, ooh, that sounds hard, actually.
I agree. We'll keep our process.
Because they don't weight them. And I was like, well, how does that work? Because her point was, if you get a C on distributions for top tier, that could be a failing grade, essentially, not to put words in their mouth. But I think for a lot of younger funds, man, it's hard to get distributions early on. So maybe you take it off the list.
I agree. And if we're doing diligence right now and there's a manager with low DPI, but we really dig into the company stories and how they're performing and the trajectory, and we're really excited about it, then that's probably fine. We'd still like DPI, but it's kind of all in the stories and how managers are managing their portfolios.
Thank you again for coming on. It's amazing to have you as a partner at Sapphire and a partner at OpenLP and Origins. And we're looking forward to doing this again.
I feel so grateful to be on here at Sapphire, a partner of yours and a partner of Nick's. And we're just hoping him a wonderful new year, and can't wait to see him next year.
Thanks for listening to the Minisode of Origins, the show where we discuss the venture capital ecosystem through the lens of a GP and an LP, though in this episode, 2 LPs. We'll be back soon with our next episode of Origins, where we'll be joined by Nina, a partner at Index Ventures. You can find that right here in this feed, and while you're there, please rate and review the podcast. It's super helpful for other folks looking for venture insights to find our show, and we truly appreciate the feedback. I'm Beezer Clarkson, and on behalf of me and my GP co-host Nick Charles, we'll be back soon. Thanks for listening.